Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Get Cooked. My name's Sarah Cook, and each week I talk to people from around our rowing community, both here in Australia and internationally. And this week I'm delighted to be joined by one of my all-time favourites from the sport of rowing. It's Jaime Fernandez, Olympic silver medalist and current Deputy High Performance Director and Head of Pathways at Rowing Australia. Hamma, welcome and thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It's great to be here, or Cookie. It seems a bit strange hearing our names said in full. Not even my father calls me Jaime anymore. It's just Hammer. So it's probably easy to go with that, I reckon.
Yeah, we'll go with that. Now, Hammer, let's go back to where it all started for you. You grew up in the Northern Territory, so how did you get into the sport of rowing?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. As you can imagine, growing up in Arnhem Land in the Territory is probably as far as you could get from the sport of rowing as one would hope. But I think a lot of my experiences in rowing have been very much just chance or opportunity. I certainly didn't set out to be a rower, clearly, if you grow up there. And I grew up in the Territory from a baby through to I was about 15. I finished year 10 there. But as fate would have it, being a reasonable sized young kid, I ended up playing a lot of senior sport from very early on. And I just happened to turn up at football training one day, and there was this man who'd come to town. He was a contract draftsman. Stan Slavinsky was his name. He was a Victorian, and he'd played VFA football. And unbeknownst to me, having known him for a few months, this day he turns up in this green and gold long sleeve to train him. I guess firstly, it seemed strange to turn up in the Territory. Maybe it hit around 25 degrees. He got a bit cold. I'm not sure, but here he was at Aussie Rules training wearing a green and gold long sleeve, and it had a badge on it. And I remember being curious, and I looked at the badge, and it actually had Australian rowing team, which I had no clue. I mean, TV came late in our life. We were very much, I guess, football focused growing up in the Territory, whether it was league or Aussie Rules or any other sport. Rowing was certainly not on our radar. I really hadn't heard much about the Olympic Games. It had not been on my radar. And as I said, rowing was probably as far away from a sport as I was going to participate as anything.
Maybe a few too many crocs up there.
Well, you'd probably row fast if you were going to row. But the reality was it just wasn't one of those sports, nor were the sort of aspirations that came with great Olympic sports like rowing on our radar. However, I asked the question, being a curious kid. I said, look, what's the story with this long sleeve, and A, B, why you're wearing it to footy training? It's not that cold. He then went on to explain that he'd been part of Mercantile Rowing Club. He'd been involved in a Trans-Tasman series. He'd done some coaching there. And I thought, okay, probably for about 10 seconds, I went, okay, wow, and moved on, because again, I just did not ever see that being part of my life. However, as fate would have it, my brother had been quite sick. He'd contracted leukemia as a young kid. My parents had to make a decision about where they might sort of take him for specialised treatment. And there was a decision between Melbourne and Adelaide. We happened to have family in Adelaide, and there was a really good specialist. And amazingly, one of our former alumni, Victoria Toogood, or Tori Toogood, her father was actually the specialist, the oncologist,
wow.
who treated, and I didn't make those connections till a little bit later, obviously. But he looked after my brother, and my family had to move down with him to Adelaide. I managed to convince them to leave me in the Territory, interestingly enough. So probably a little bit unusual at the time. But again, I think my journey's been punctuated by interesting experiences, but also really good people looking after me. And that was one of those times. But anyway, Stan basically told me about this sport, didn't think much of it. Next thing you know, I'm being asked to move to Adelaide, sort of dragging my sorry butt out of the Territory most unhappily, moving to a city that was cold. I'd lived this great life in the Territory, which was just, we had the Arafura Sea on one side and this magnificent bushland on the other. And we just spent our whole time outdoors playing, camping, fishing, hunting, doing all these sorts of things that, kids maybe just didn't experience if you live further south, I guess. So it's definitely not something I wanted to do. However, I end up in Adelaide. And so my parents, I guess much to their frustration, sort of going, oh, we're going to have to find this kid a school, somewhere he's going to behave himself, he's going to be safe. We know he doesn't want to be here. So we turn up to this first school. And it's a really interesting point in my life because I remember this really vividly as we're walking in with my mother, and my brother had sort of almost been given day release from hospital on this day. So he wasn't looking too flashy, he was being wheeled in. And this registrar looks at us and basically says, after a short period of time, we don't take people like you at this school.
What?
Yeah. And I remember going, wonder what that means. And
what does that even mean?
Well, I don't know. And maybe my mum had put my rap sheet up and not my academic transcript, although there probably wasn't much difference between the two of them at the time. I'd never read a book. I have to admit, I didn't do a lot of work up until through to year 10. Mind you, things changed after that, but that's another story. But here we were being confronted with this moment in time where basically someone says, well, we don't value you. We don't reckon this is the place for you. We really don't want to have to deal with you and your family's circumstances. And, might I suggest you find another school?
Wow.
So, and so you can imagine then the feeling that my mother has. She sort of feels like, hey, she's dragged me out of the place I love. She's not really able to set a positive experience up for me from the start. My brother's sick. We go back to the hospital. And amazingly at the time, my brother had a really rare form of leukemia, particularly for young people. So he contracted that when he was 8 and unfortunately lost his battle with that just 2 weeks before his 12th birthday. But amazingly, there was another young man in the isolation bed, or the room next to him, who had the identical form of leukemia, which was really a new time. His parents were there as well, and they noticed how we came back, dragging our sorry backsides in, not looking too happy about what had just happened. Asked the question again, another moment in time where someone sort of just took a second to actually care. And they said, what happened? We told them the story. And they said, oh, look, our son Andrew, he goes to a school in the city. It's a Catholic boys' school. We'll ring the school and see if they will, see you. Anyway, they agreed. So here we were the next day, and I'm getting prepared for round 2. Another place that basically saying, we don't want you. And of course, I'm starting to formulate a plan now as how do I get back to the territory. This is almost playing into my hands. I don't have to live in the city. I can. You're
like, great, no one will take me. I'll go back to where I came from.
My mum didn't think that, but anyway, that's beside the point. So here I am at this. I walk into this school. It's an inner city school, a Christian Brothers school. The door opens. Principal, he was probably my size now, maybe not then. He was about 6'4" or 5. He had this brilliant shock of white hair, like Billy Idol, with his crew cut. And you're sort of quite an imposing man, and you sort of looked at him. But the first thing he did, he walked out and he said, put his hand out, and he said, what can I do for you? So complete contrast to the experience I had the day before. He welcomed us in, he sat down, and he said, tell me your story. And I explained to him, where I grew up, what it was like. I told him about this story of, at this stage, I sort of just what the journey had been, what had been happening with my brother. And he paused for a moment, and it's, again, one of those really vivid sort of images in my head still to this day. And he said, you know what? I think this place is for you. And I went, wow, this is a whole different thing. I wasn't expecting this. It caught me quite off guard. And I can remember looking at my mother, and she's got tears in her eyes, sort of thinking, oh my goodness, finally we're going to have somewhere to corral him and keep him safe. But this gentleman, Brother Marks, as was his name, just basically said, I think this place is for you. So we welcome you here with open arms, and we look forward to you being part of our community. The next step was a really interesting one, which leads into my long-winded story, how I get into Rowan. He says, right, every boy at this school plays sport. Typically you do a summer and winter sport. Clearly, good sort of Catholic boys tradition. Footy is going to be the key driver. You know that through Joey's. I was ready-made for that, having been playing in men's teams for the last 2 or 3 years. So this was going to be great, and I think he was excited about what I could potentially provide to the school's team. he said, okay, what about summer? Almost as a throwaway line. I sort of looked at the list and there was rowing. And so I thought for a moment. I said, do you think I could have a go at rowing? And again, this guy, he sort of he didn't react. He didn't jump at things. He didn't go, this kid silly, rowing. Clearly the territory and rowing don't match up at this point in time. And he said, why? So he took the time to actually understand why I might choose something so obscure as a sport of rowing when compared to my journey to that point in time. And I explained my story. I explained the interaction I'd had with this guy, Stan. And I explained when I left the territory on the night that I flew out, the night before I flew out, on my bed was a trophy. And there was a simple note. And the note basically said, and this was from Stan, because we both, interestingly enough, had won the best and fairest in the grand final that year. Me as a young buck and he as, I guess, the old bull, and shared the award. And anyway, he got this trophy and he put it on my bed with a simple note with a bit of duct tape stuck to it. And basically it said, whatever you do, you'll do well. Follow your dreams and don't let anyone ever tell you can't do it.
Wow.
And it's as simple as that. And so I keep that and I still have that. And that has been something that has been a real driver in my life to this day. So I tell Brother Mark's this story and he sort of sits really thoughtfully for a period of time. And he says, can you let me think about it? Because most of the boys have rowed since year 7 at the school. So you're in year 11, you'll get 3 terms of rowing. You'll have 1 term this year. You'll have another 2 terms when you go into year 12. It's not a simple sport. It's a little bit more complicated. And if you haven't done it before, it might be difficult to pick up. And we left it at that. And I ticked at athletics, because I've done a lot of athletics up until that point, as my second option. So here I am the next day, sitting in the foyer of the school, still a little bit, I don't want to be, I'm in a grey suit, trousers, polished shoes, having had to call my grandfather to work out a tie, having never worn a tie. I didn't own a pair of jeans. I did most things in barefoot in the territory. It didn't matter whether I was running, riding, playing sport. So here I was, completely a fish out of water, having caught 2 buses to get to this school, having catch a bus to school prior to that, going, what on earth am I doing? The head of rowing happens to walk past, and I think quite strategically at this point, because he's probably been tipped off that this big buffhead has turned up in the school, and you never know, you might want to have a chat to him. And Grant Bennett was his name, and he was instrumental in terms of the care he showed for me. Again, another one of those examples of someone who said, you know what, you might be a big rough buffhead, but there's got to be something about you that I think we can polish up and, make a decent human being out of. So I stood up, shook hands. So he sort of went, okay, well, this could be good. Again, asked me the story. Why rowing? Headmaster reckons you want to have a go at rowing. Why do you want to do rowing? And I explained the story. And he simply says, there's a ute out the back of the school. Bring your runners and some footy shorts tomorrow. Chuck your bag in the back and then follow the other kids on the 5K run to the shed. And that's what I did. I took a chance. They put me in a boat. He wasn't very complimentary about what I looked like to start with. But that was Ben.
I can't imagine why.
That was him to a T. He's this great, great man. He's a fabulous guy. But I loved it from the first stroke I took. And from that moment, I was hooked. And I guess probably like you, Cookie, if you cut me, I would bleed rowing. It's as simple as that. And I guess from those early experiences at school, the amount of care that was taken, the amount of support I was given by that school and those people, in particular in that sport of rowing and some of my teachers. And unfortunately, I lost my brother in that first year at the school. But they never wavered in their support of me. They never took a backward step. It was clear that I came from a different place, a different culture. As I said, I'd never read a book. I hadn't done a single bit of homework up until year 10. I went to school because you could play footy at lunchtime. Simple as that. And my mates were there, and there was nothing else to do if I sat at home. But this place not only opened my horizons to this amazing world that existed outside of my little community. But it just showed me what it meant when people actually cared about you and wanted you to be or succeed. And so I guess from that moment, it was almost unconsciously, but I figured I'll devote my life to this, pure and simple.
It's amazing how, these experiences that you had in your childhood, which you recount and seem to remember so vividly, both positive and negative, have been so formative, not only obviously in your athletic career, but in your whole life and how, and in knowing you relatively well, how you approach everything that you do as well. So it's really amazing to hear from you some of these quite early childhood memories and how they've really helped to develop you into who you are. And on that, I guess let's talk about what happens next. You like and you're good at footy, rowing in the summer. What made you want to stick with rowing and pursue that after school, and how did that come about as opposed to, just going off to uni and giving sport away or following footy or whatever else might have happened after school for you?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting because even though I sort of, I took to the sport really quickly, we were a program that at best had 8 people plus a coxswain. So the school had rowed for about 100 odd years at that time. It was an old school, been involved in sport, but, it won the Heather River once in all of that time. And literally our crew in that final year was made up of, I think there might have been at least half the crew had done some rowing and half the crew hadn't rowed at all. So it was this amazing sort of little ecosystem of people who effectively, all these footballers who we'd become mates, said, "Rightio, let's go and have a go at this rowing." And I dragged a couple in because I'd started. And we had this fabulous coach in Slim Lawrence. We had this guy, Grant Bennett, as the head of rowing. But literally, we had 9 people to chuck in a boat. We won the Heather River out of that. But it's because we had this incredible, I think, camaraderie. We clearly had, and I didn't know anything about talent ID or talent transfer or developing athletes. And, I can still remember running up Colonel Light Hill, doing hill sprints and piggybacking people up. And our coach had these old railway sleeper pegs. And we used to do this calisthenic stuff at lunchtime. And instead of training on the Torrens like we always did, he took us to the Port River. So he was almost a pioneer in his time, and this is obviously the late 80s when, probably just before, I guess school sport and school rowing really sort of almost exploded as a business in terms of sort of more professional coaching, these were volunteers. And my coach had coached at the school, I think in the end was 20 or 30 years.
Wow.
As a volunteer.
It's amazing.
It's incredible. So my experience then was those types of people who gave to you. They didn't take, they didn't want anything. It wasn't about them. They just loved seeing young people succeed. They loved the sport clearly. And they were also, even though they may have been in the sport for a long time, they were still innovative. They were still looking for ideas. And as I just shared, we were doing lots of little things that we didn't realise. And maybe you couldn't do this now, but they gave me the code to the shed. So in the holidays, I would call the boys up and say, "Rightio, I'll see you at the shed. We'll do some gym. Then we'll ride."
No, you definitely couldn't do that now.
Then we'd ride our bike down to Glenelg and we'd run along the beach, or we'd do a ride up Mount Lofty to his place and have a barbecue. So it was so much was self-driven, but we were also given the freedom, and they also recognised that probably within us we had some leaders and some drivers who wanted, without even realising it, wanted to do something really good. And lo and behold, these 9 kids in smallest program in the whole state go out and win the Heather River, which was fabulous. So that was a pivotal moment, and it's not just that, but there's also been these other moments where I've had some really important people say, "We're going to take you under our wing. We care about you, and we want you to succeed. We want you to be happy." And those sort of punctuations, I guess, in my history have mean that I sort of look at the sport in the same way. What can I do for others? I know it's a little bit long-winded, but I am getting to a response. So why did I continue? Well, that's why I was continuing. I'd been recruited by West Adelaide to play football for them. I've been fortunate enough to play in the state versus independent schools footy. I love footy, and it was clearly a pathway I was interested in taking as well. Because again, I still hadn't put two and two together. I didn't know about the Olympics. I wasn't a kid who had on his list, all right, I want to row, I want to win the head of the river, I want to go to the AIS. I didn't know what that was. I want to go to the Olympics. It just wasn't part of my world. I'd never heard of university until I'd moved to Adelaide. I didn't, I heard you say about going to university. Well, that wasn't on my radar. I was thinking of getting a trade, potentially going into the army or the military or doing something like that, leaving school in year 10. That was probably my path, and that wouldn't be inconsistent with lots of kids and people I grew up with at the time. But again, those people at that school said, you know what, this kid's probably got a little something. Why don't we manufacture a situation to see if we can get him into a boat after school? So we'd finished that season. I was in pre-season training with West Adelaide. I get a phone call from my coach. What are you up to, you big buffhead? I said, I've been training at footy. Oh, how's that going? Yeah, going really well. He said, Adelaide Uni Boat Club, they've got a crew training, but one of their guys is sick and they want someone to fill in. Set up, mind you.
This is absolutely a stitch up. Yeah.
It is. And I'm going, when is it? What time? It's tomorrow morning. I said, okay, I can ride my bike from where I live to West Lakes, which is about a 45-minute ride. I said, all right, I'll jump on my bike, I'll ride down, and I'll jump in the boat. I said, I haven't rowed, obviously, at this stage. I was coming towards the end of the school year. I said, don't worry, you'll be right. Anyway, I turn up this training session, sort of looking around for the guy who's supposedly sick or injured, who actually ends up being a friend of mine long term, and a family that, again, takes me under their sort of care and tutelage, being the Southcott family, a well-known rowing family in South Australia. I jump in his seat, I think it was the 5 seat. He's running along the bank, and I'm sort of looking across going, we can't be too injured or sick if he's doing that. I go for a row in this boat, thinking not much of it, thinking it's a one-off. Do the session, seems to be fine. Get out of the boat, go to take off. My school coaches turned up to watch this too, which I thought was, again, a little bit odd. But, I wasn't the brightest kid going around, so I didn't put two and two together just yet. And it was their plan of how do we get him into the sport, and maybe this group of guys would be the way to do that, to facilitate keeping him in the sport. And it was, because they were the most brilliant bunch of young men. They were fabulous guys. They were great fun. They clearly loved the sport and enjoyed it. And so it was really a really smart way, I guess, of sort of drawing me in. And again, it sort of reminds me what's fun about the sport, and that's the people. Yep. And that's doing the sport with those sorts of people. And so I had this really, what was quite a short and intense period with Adelaide Uni, because the next part of the plan clearly started to be put in place too, and that was them talking to a gentleman by the name of Reinhold Batschi, or Herr Batschi as I call him, and saying, hey, you know what, we've got this young kid, you might be interested. And at Nationals that year in the beautiful Lake Barrington, my favourite course, I was introduced to this man, and they said, hey, this is Jaime Fernandez from Adelaide. Riney, in his true fashion, says, who are you? What do you do? Tell him a little bit sort of intimidated by his presence. And he goes, oh, okay. Well, maybe I get you to come to Canberra and we'll do some testing with you. And that was it. That was sort of, I didn't think much of it again. I thought, okay, interesting chat. I had this great experience with these guys. They made the sport fun for me. I thought, okay, maybe I'll do this. I go to Nationals with them. Next thing you know, I get this piece of paper in the letterbox. It wasn't emails back in those days. It was a courier pigeon. Letter turns up in the letterbox saying, we'd like to invite you to come to Canberra to do a test, to potentially be a scholarship holder. And this all happened, Cookie, within finishing school in November, and then I was in Canberra by mid-year the year after.
Wow.
And away I went. So that's, all of 2 or 3 years there I was sort of just on this amazing ride and journey with people just taking a chance on me, just giving me an opportunity. But I guess equally being robust enough, being I guess being bold enough to take the chance too. So, you know, that's how I sort of ultimately made that decision to go. And I can still remember my dad saying to me, he goes, why would you row? You don't even make any money from it.
Well, that's a good point.
Well, yeah, but you got to understand, he's a pragmatic man who born and grew up in Spain, in the poor parts of Spain. So his life was about survival. So purely about how do I get food, how do I get clothing, how do I get shelter. It wasn't about going and, even though he played professional soccer, even when he stopped that, he just made the decision, I've got to live a life and support a family. So he's very pragmatic. Yeah. And so he's saying to me, why would you go and do this sport? And it was a good question. I said, I've heard about this new thing. And he said, what's this new thing? He goes, this thing called the Olympic Games. Maybe I could have an opportunity to go to it. And literally that was sort of the conversation I had with my father at the time. Bizarrely though, I break my arm. My good friend Michael Southcott, whose seat I took, actually helped me break my arm in a training session. I end up with my arm in plaster prior to having to go for my trial. Now you can imagine ringing Reinhold up and saying, oh look, Mr. Batschi, I've broken my arm. I know I'm meant to be there in 4 weeks, but plaster has to be on for 6. And he says, well, okay, well, what would you like me to do? And I remember having this conversation going, good question. And he said, oh, you don't want to come? I said, no, I'll be there. So I convinced my mum to cut the plaster off, 3.5.
Oh, my gosh.
She took my arm out of plaster. I still had a fracture through my radius, and the stylus process was sort of just hanging on the edge. I took it off. I turned up in Canberra with this atrophied right arm. I then had to do a 2,500k erg test, 2.5 on the old concepts with the heavy load. I couldn't feel my arm by the end, and then I got put into boats, and we did these 1,500 metre, races against each other for about 2 or 3 days straight on the course in Canberra. And by the end, I couldn't even use my arm. And I can still remember having a conversation with Ryan. He said, "Oh, I thought you would have been a little better." And I said, yeah, but I have got a broken arm still. I've only been in plaster for 3.5 weeks. And he sort of looked at me and clearly had forgotten the conversation we'd had on the phone. And he sort of went, is this kid telling me the truth or what? He goes, oh, okay. All right, I'll let you know.
That's pretty good for one arm.
Thankfully, he took a chance once again. And he invited me to be a scholar. And I spent 10 years, a fantastic journey.
It was... a bit of a different system back then, and an amazing opportunity with the AIS. And I guess for me, it was a bit similar, sort of I'd made under 23 teams and kind of got plucked out of there by Lyle, who was the head coach at the time, and given the opportunity. And the system operates a little bit differently now, but we'll talk about that a bit later, about how that all works. But going back to your journey, so you're in the AIS, you're a young man. At what point did the Olympic Games really start to feature for you as a goal? And talk to us about your Olympic experiences.
Yeah, and look, to be honest, I'm not sure if there was an absolute moment where I decided to do that. I still think because of my journey being so short and young in terms of what it was, in terms of years, I still probably haven't made that connection fully. But again, what I was really fortunate about was clearly I walked into a place that was just incredible. What a structure, what a setup, what a man in terms of Reinhold, in terms of having him not only be part of my rowing life, but continue to be part of my life. So, that's a discussion certainly would love to have is, about him and the impact and the influence he had.
Yeah, well, on that, tell us a bit about Reinhold, because everyone knows his name. If they didn't know Reinhold or don't know Reinhold, they at least know that his name's on the Men's National Training Centre in Canberra. Right. And we heard Coatsy talking about him when I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago about bringing him out to Australia and effectively starting the system of Australian rowing, as we now know it today. such an influential man in terms of Australian rowing and its setup, and I guess why we're in the position that we are as one of the foundation Olympic sports here in Australia. But there's, I guess, the man, the myth, the legend when it comes to Reinhold. So tell us a bit about your experiences with him and what he was like as a coach and a mentor for you.
Yeah, and interesting, I was only talking to Ronnie last week when we were having a bit of a chat and a laugh, as we do, and just love reminiscing with him. I feel blessed and fortunate that he has been part of my life. And as I said, it wasn't just as an athlete, it's continued to this day. And, I see him as a mentor, as someone you can go and have a great conversation, really intelligent man, and obviously listening to you and Katie talk about he and Bolt's bringing Riney into the country, what a pivotal moment for our sport, because it did change forever. And, the successes that the sport has had, the footprint that it has, is because of those men and many other men and women who have contributed to the sport. But clearly that was a significant point in time. So you can only imagine walking into a place as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, just out of school. You really know nothing about the sport. I owned one Zudi, which happened to be given to me by one of the guys at Adelaide Uni. I still rode in my NT footy shorts when I was at school because I didn't really want to hop in a rowing suit at that point in time. So I was still a bit old school. I was still very much a bush kid. I walk into this place with this guy sort of almost giving me nothing. And he had a reasonably fearsome reputation. And listening to Coatsy and the story about he and Bolts, where they're just being told what to do. Well, it wasn't any different as an athlete. You were told what to do. And so, but I was probably fortunate that, again, I spoke about my father, who, again, was a really important person in terms of shaping my life, because there was a man who was earnest, hardworking. We were very blue collar as a family. Like, again, really quite removed from what the traditional rowing sort of picture looks like. He'd work 6-7 days a week, 12-14 hours a day to make ends meet. So that was my background. So hard work was not the thing that I feared. It was probably more working out, am I good enough to do this? Is this something that I really should do or shouldn't do, or should I try and get on with life? My dad and I had that conversation. And so then I walk into this other man who, wasn't so dissimilar. And so I actually consider myself quite fortunate that I sort of had this experience, notwithstanding my dad has an incredibly strong Spanish accent. So then you go to Reinhold, who has a very strong Romanian accent. And I was probably one of the few people at the time who I just understood him really quickly. I had an ear for accents and things like that, so that wasn't an issue. And I can remember rowing along with my long-term pair partner, Nick Porzik, in the early days, and he said, I just don't understand what he's saying. And I said, I'll translate. I spoke to Ronnie about this, and we have a good laugh about it. But he was a strong, almost fearsome sort of reputation. He was no nonsense, but that suited me. What he wanted to know is, are you prepared to do the work? He tested you without doubt to see what you were made of. Did you have the grit to survive what is a really tough sport? It's demanding. It has high expectations on you physically, emotionally, personally. And so I guess his natural way and his background and experiences were to, how do you filter that out, and you find the people who are prepared to, stand the test of time and stay there with you. And quite proud of the fact that, my journey has spanned that sort of 10-year block with him. But the thing about him that was really important, and I think sometimes is not always understood, is how much he truly cared about the sport. And you can see that through his actions in terms of his devotion to it, his giving of himself, his family sort of giving of him to the sport. And that you're part of his family. And, so Ronnie he would get frustrated and upset, and we were talking about this last week again. He said, sometimes I was dealing with so many things, and I'd come out in the water and I'd be sort of rough and gruff with you guys. And I said, yeah, but I get that. I can understand that. But we sort of face those sorts of experiences now, working and being a parent. We all have those moments. But the thing that was never in question for me was how much he actually wanted me to succeed. how much he wanted others to succeed, how much he wanted the sport to succeed. So it wasn't about him. He didn't do it for his own personal acclaim or glory or financial reward. It was far from that. And so he set this system and structure up so that we could succeed as a nation. And so for those of us who had the privilege of rowing under him, we were the beneficiaries of it because he backed you, he supported you. Yeah, he was tough on us. There's no question about it, but it wasn't about him. And I think that's a really important distinction to make between, you hear the rhetoric of, tough, hard coach. Athletes have got to be hard and tough. Yeah, there's lots of different ways you can look at that. The thing that mattered most is that he actually cared. And that
I think I was never coached by Reinhold, but he was still one of the coaches at the AIS during my time there. And the thing that always struck me was that there was never any ego or bravado when it came to him. Like you say, he was this real purist, and he was working with the, some of the Breaking the Drought athletes at that period of time, and I guess mentoring some of these young athletes in the sport. And that's what always stood out for me was his genuine love for the sport, his care for the athletes. From time to time, he'd come out in the boat and do a bit of coaching of us as well. But I'd heard all of these stories about how fearsome he was, and I have no doubt about that. And, in terms of wanting to get the most out of his athletes, but there never seemed to be that ego there when talking to him or dealing with him. And, and I think that's why there's so many athletes, throughout several generations, yourself and afterwards, who would only have, at the end of it, really fond memories of their time being coached by him and of their experience in the sport at the AIS.
Absolutely. And look, it's shaped what I've done. I've continued to be committed to the sport, which I'm really blessed and fortunate to be able to do. And, they're my examples. And, he's clearly one of them. Obviously, you've had people like Coatsy and there's people like Bolts and Chris Knowles and Doc Steve Hinchy, rest in peace. Obviously was farewelled recently. To me, they're the true examples of, servant leadership, of people giving. And to me, that's what inspires me. And I was asked recently about, who's the athlete that you have that, whoa, moment. Funnily enough, I don't. And I don't know if that's because of my background and the way I grew up and the place that I grew up in, or, always being kept quite grounded by family and friends and things like that. I admire greatly athletes who have clearly got wonderful genetics, DNA, have found that through time and circumstance the right sports and opportunities, have gone on and excelled and succeeded. It's amazing. It's fantastic. And we've clearly got some incredible examples of that in our sport, both past and present. Our current athletes have just done an amazing job, so I take my hat off to them. But that's not necessarily the thing for me personally that I go, oh, wow. For me personally, it's guys like those people who who understood, I guess, what it took, who were visionary, but who just gave of themselves over and over again to you as an athlete, to the sport. Because I guess that wonderful phrase that, it takes a village to raise a child. Yes, we're athlete-centred, but I think we are coach-driven. Because those connections, and whether it's coach or someone as a mentor, as I shared about my coaches at school, or Benno, the rowing master, or that principal who took a chance, or other family who said, no, we'll take you under our wing and care about you. They're the things that actually I go, wow, that servant leadership, those people who really give of themselves. And like anyone else, I celebrate, sports, success and the stars in that. But I think the people who inspire me most, who they're those sorts of people who actually are givers. They're just giving all the time of themselves to make sure that people like me have had the opportunity I had.
Absolutely. And, I know that's something that Tim McLaren's always said, is that rowing is a coach-driven sport. And even in my own time as a coach, taking that time to find those athletes and help, give them that opportunity and set them on that pathway. But also, I had that happen for me as well. You know, people plucking you out of relative obscurity and setting you on a path that you never thought was possible. You know, and it is those, you know, chance meetings or that one conversation that can really just change the pathway of the life for a young person particularly. And I know, like you, that's something I'm incredibly passionate about too.
Yeah.
And, you know, moving on now, I guess, to your Olympic experiences, and I always feel, I say this every time, I feel bad, you know, when we fast forward through months or years, because it sort of almost belittles, you know, the huge, I guess, time and energy and achievements that happen along the way. But let's fast forward to your Olympic Games. Let's compare and contrast your two Olympic experiences. Obviously different performance outcomes, but it's more than that. Can you tell us a little bit about your Olympic Games experiences?
Yeah, look, they were quite varied. You know, I was really fortunate to go to 3 games: Barcelona, Atlanta, and Sydney. Very different. Although I would, from my personal experience, again, just my experience, I would argue that Sydney and Barcelona had some similarities in terms of the feel, the culture, the people. Atlanta was a wee bit different for me in terms of the sort of feeling around it. However, they were all magnificent experiences. And, you know, if there's one thing you can do in your life, then I would encourage people to either go as a spectator or as a volunteer or as a coach or administrator or as an athlete. You know, it is just the most unique and surreal experience you'll ever have. But the 3 games were very different. So taking into account that, you know, in Barcelona, I'm going to a country where my father was born. So it has really significant meaning for me. It was one of those, as they say, that, you know, the modern games where things change quite a great deal. We were at a sub-site village in Banyoles, and we were transported in. And there was a bit of toing and froing. Do we go to the games? We've got a race not long after. But thankfully, my coach and the senior guys who were in my crew said, no, look, this is really important. We think we should go. It's part of actually helping you understand the enormity of the games, the significance of it. And for someone like me, I'm still going to the Olympic Games. And even when I'm in Barcelona, I'm sitting there going, this doesn't seem real, because 4 years earlier, I walked out of the bush, literally barefoot and into a city, and away you go. So here you are walking into this magnificent stadium, light bulbs and flashes, and you know, there's the dream team lined up over there, and, you know, other great athletes and things like that, and you're wandering through going, wow, this is just amazing. And we had a great crew. Like, we had a fabulous crew. They weren't going to send an 8 to the games in '92. You know, the results prior to that had been a bit hit and miss. There's clear the Awesome Foursome are just magnificent crew, and we were the beneficiaries actually of the change that occurred in the Awesome Foursome with Sam Patton having to complete his medical degrees and coming into our 8. And so we're in this trial in Barrington, and we're going up and down in Cox 4s, headwind, tailwind, they're swapping crews. The crew they think is going to be the Cox 4 gets beaten, and so on and so on. And before you know it, I think everyone throws their hands up and said, all right, let's put an 8 in the water and see what happens.
Yeah.
So they put this 8 out of all these young sort of Turks, and I'll include Sam in that young Turks thing. He would appreciate that, I'm sure. And we do a really good job. And so, you know, again, Reinhold Batschi, Richo, the selectors go, well, okay, let's take a punt. Let's send this young 8 of guys, you know. And for a lot of us, for someone like me, it's your first time in a senior team and going to the Olympic Games.
Wow.
And I wasn't alone, though. You know, there's Ben Dodwell, Bo Hanson, Rob Scott, you know, obviously mentioned Sam, Peter Murphy, you know, Simon Spriggs, David Colvin, all these wonderful names, Wayne Diplock, all these people who've played roles in our sport, but they're all quite young people. And Sam was the one who had this experience. He was a world champion from the 1990 Worlds in Barrington from the 4. He became a linchpin in that crew. But we just had this wonderful camaraderie. We were well led by people like Sam and Richo, Brian Richardson, our coach. And they just made the experience something really quite special. And so you just fell in love with it. And so walking into this stadium with those guys was just the most amazing experience. We had a wonderful setup at Banyoles. It was a beautiful lake. The Spanish people put on an incredible games. The team was really quite harmonious. There was lots of young people. It wasn't just our 8. There was lots of young people on that team. And it really had this fabulous sort of bond. In those days, we used to spend, about 3 months overseas, and we were based in Lucerne, Switzerland, of all places. Horrible place to have to. Terrible. Probably spent as much time as I have there as anywhere, bizarrely. But you grew in confidence. You obviously trained. You worked hard. You had these great role models in the awesome foursome and the Peter Anthony's on the team as well, who you could sort of look at how they worked and how diligent they were. We had great coaches, as I said, like Richo and Tim and Noel, and obviously Riney leading the team. Tomo. We're really fortunate that the coaching team was strong as well. And in the end, there was a time where there were semi-finals in the men's 8 at the Olympics.
Wow.
Tough competition. It was hot as anything in Spain, which probably suited me coming from the territory, but I can remember how hot it was. And the competition was fierce. And we managed to make the A final as this raw, inexperienced group, finishing 5th in the final. So it was a great experience. And the whole games experience was wonderful, going back into the village, experiencing the success of other athletes in our team and watching the Spanish people just embrace the spirit of the games. Atlanta, again, a bit different. Again, based out. We had a crew that had some repeat offenders, I guess, had come through from the Barcelona crew. There were some changes and some new people coming in. And again, a really talented crew with lots of people that ultimately went on and won and had success at either world and Olympic level. And I think that's a really important point, that there was this ability to retain good young athletes in the system, both male and female, in sweep and in sculling. And what you saw was this progression. And obviously Atlanta has, arguably our most successful games in terms of the medals won, the A finals we were in. And look, the sport had some challenges prior to that, but it had been able to right itself, to get itself back on track. And I mentioned Doc Hinchey at the time, and he played a key role in that as well, as did other people. But we had great success as a team. And that was a really important thing, because what it did is I think it laid a platform for what came in Sydney. And clearly, an Olympics in your home country is, I'm just not sure how you compare it to anything else. Your family and friends can be a part of it. Interestingly enough, there was, I think, mixed sentiment about the games early on. However, I still have a moment in my head when that torch hit the Sydney Harbour Bridge. It's like all the press changed. Everything became about positivity. There was no more sort of talk about, what's the point of this and all the rest of it. When that torch hit that bridge, it's like it just came alive. And I'll tell you, there was a couple of key moments in the Sydney Games that are really memorable. And I remember having, this old video camera, and I remember filming us as we're walking into the tunnel underneath the stadium, and you could hear the roar and all the volunteers are lining the tunnel, and they're just chanting, sort of Aussie, 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 as away it goes, and this wave of sort of emotion sort of hits you. And we'd only made a decision quite late in the piece as to whether we would attend. And the decision was basically left to each crew. And we were staying out at Penrith, and we're having to race again, not long after, a day or two after. And we sat and thought about it for quite some time. And the difference probably between the 3 games is this time we were focused on an outcome. There was a clear purpose about getting a result. And our crew had really set about doing that well. And our European campaign had suggested that we were going to be really quite competitive. And we'd sort of been playing cat and mouse with the British crew through the various regattas and things like that. So in the end, we said, you know what? We've got to go to the opening ceremony. Let's go and actually embrace this. Let's use this as almost a motivator. Because one of the things that we'd done as a team, and we'd been training and based in Australia, we actually moved around a bit. So we trained in Penrith, and then we actually went up to Bundaberg, which was a fabulous place, and we trained there. But we almost started to feel we were too far removed from what was happening. So moving back into Penrith, going to the games, walking into this stadium of 100,000+ people, just erupting, throwing the rubber kangaroos into the crowd. just walking along with this big stupid grin the whole time, like you just couldn't stop smiling. It was amazing experience. And then, we missed by that much on the gold medal. 0.8 of a second or something like that. How do you measure that? We were beaten by a better crew on the day. We had a fabulous journey. We were really fortunate to have, again, a close-knit group. We had Brian Richardson coaching, who'd been my coach in 92. Steve Evans had coached me in 96, where we finished sixth in the final again. And as I said, all those moments were pivotal to getting to that 2000 experience, where just the way we thought had changed. It wasn't that I think we lacked any talent or ability, but I'd say one of the critical catalysts was having the guy Mike Mackay come into our crew. Tough guy, just sort of takes no prisoners, but what he understood was how to be successful and how to win. And so what we needed to do was how do we get that knowledge from him? How do we work with him to understand that? And how do we transfer that into our physical capability, our robustness as young men, to then actually put that into boat moving and to do that consistently? And that was a really pivotal moment for us, having that person come into that boat and challenge us. And he really did challenge us many, many times. And we had to be prepared to accept the challenge and to ultimately take it on. But to me, that was critical in us ultimately getting the result we did. You sort of can sit and reflect, what would have been, what might have been, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. And just really proud of, I guess, the way we went about the journey, incredible friendships that we now have as a result. And, it's something that was forged in fire, so to speak. That when we stood on that podium and received our medal in front of our family and friends, it was, probably one of the greatest experiences you can have as an athlete.
It's absolutely incredible. And to think that in just over a month, it'll be 20 years since that happened, which is unbelievable. I spoke to Katie Folks last week, and she had some very similar memories about choosing to walk in the opening ceremony for the Sydney Olympics and that feeling of walking in. And we had an interesting conversation about, where I think certainly when I came through, we were told it's all about shutting out the emotion and staying professional and businesslike and da-da-da-da-da. But I think there's something to be said about actually leaning into that experiencing that emotion and helping that to drive performance. Do you think that helped your experience and your outcome?
Absolutely, Cookie. I was, funnily enough, I was listening to you and Katie chat. She and I sat on the plane together out of London again, and we were chatting about, well, it might have been one of the directions anyway, we were chatting about, she was asking questions about, I had a great coxswain in Brett Hayman in Pepe over 2 Olympic cycles. So, she was asking about him and how he operated. So it was lovely to sort of see her speaking with you. But I do. And probably a little bit like you, it was an interesting period. The sport's evolved a bit. You didn't really have a lot of family involvement. I was married at that stage going into Sydney. We were expecting our first child. Lots of MJ and my conversation was about what bill can we pay and when, because, we didn't have the fabulous support we have. We had fabulous support, from the AIS and the Sports Commission at the time. But as an athlete, that sort of went into supporting you to do your training. Now we have, on top of Sport Australia and the AIS support, we have Hancock Prospecting and our patron and Mrs. Reinhold. So that really does help our athletes. But then I'm having these conversations with MJ about what bill we pay and when. And so it was easy to get drawn away from what was the task at hand right there and then, to back to being quite pragmatic, saying, look, I'll be back at work next week and we can start to pay those bills. Don't worry, we'll get it sorted. And I was quite fortunate. She was an amazing woman who supported me in my ambitions to do that. So she kept a lot of that stuff away from me. And that's why I think going to something like the opening ceremony ultimately became a really important thing, because you get caught up in the day-to-day, almost not the mundane, but just the reality of living a life outside of the sport bubble. So going to the opening ceremony, I think you described really well, is actually leaning into the experience, leaning into the emotion. And I remember just feeling so uplifted by it. that we came out, I think, 2 days later. I remember we were going out to do a warm-up piece, and we had this, everyone has this plan, everything's got to do this. We did one piece in the warm-up, and for rowing people, and we went out to, and normally you do maybe 3x10 or 30-stroke piece, a few starts. We did one piece of about 15 strokes. The boat went straight to about 38 to 40. It was on what we determined gold medal speed, and it was done. And it was like there was this call in the boat said, "That's it, we don't need any more. We'll paddle to the start. Away you go."
Don't tell that to my athletes, please, because here I am trying to tell them that they can't just row to the start.
But that was the reality. That I believe came because of going to the opening ceremony, walking into the stadium for the first time when it had people. Like that moment was just amazing in itself. Putting your boat down for the first time. We came out of that 750 metre mark under the bridge, and at the games you actually rowed across to the opposite side of the course. Unbeknownst to us, there was actually people up that far. We didn't realise at that point. We'd done lots of visualisation about, what it would feel like, taste like, smell like, sound like, all that sort of stuff. Most of the time I stayed awake through that, but that's another story. But here we are rowing across the course, and this roar goes up, and you think, oh my goodness, and your heart rate goes right through the roof, and you try and settle yourself. So all those little moments sort of just got you ready. And I describe it really well when you talk about leaning into it as opposed to avoiding it and being scared of it. Clearly you've got, it's individualised. For some people that might be a distraction. For someone like me though, that was invigorating, and I just was like, open the gate, let me go. We had a fabulous heat. Away we went. Incredible
to hear what that felt like for you, and for people who haven't had that experience of racing in Olympic Games. I think that really vivid memory for you, and hearing you talk about that can maybe transport them to what that must have felt like for you and for the guys, and for what you went on to achieve as well. And look, I know we could keep talking all day, but let's talk about what you're doing now. You spoke earlier, you said if you cut you bleed rowing, which I totally get, and the reason why you've stayed connected to the sport has been the people and the impact that they've had on you and your life. And I think reading is what you're saying as well, and this is very much my experience, is feeling part of something, part of a community, part of a family that you just couldn't imagine ever really walking away from. So you're now the Deputy High Performance Director at Rowing Australia and lead on the Pathway program. Can you tell us a little bit about that program and your role, and I guess building that systemic approach to success and development in the pathway for our athletes now?
It's just been wonderful, to be honest. I guess I think myself to be one of the luckiest people in the world, because I work in a space that deals with young people, coaches, supporters, parents, administrators, state sporting, our state bodies, our National Institute network, our wonderful clubs. I guess I get to deal with probably what is approximately 90% of our rowing population in that world. So it is a really broad, dynamic, sort of invigorating space to be in. Challenging, yes. Certainly nothing's ever perfect, but it's just this amazing sort of ecosystem of people and different systems that I get to work with. So being the Deputy Performance Director, as I said, it's a wonderful opportunity that I have. I'm a teacher by trade, so to speak. So here's this kid who never read a book, ultimately goes to become a teacher. And I'm sure many of my teachers sort of just shake their head going, how does that work? But again, I think it goes into the things that I value most, and that is about education, opportunity, the pastoral side of things. So that's probably where I have a real passion for. And so I've had this wonderful opportunity to remain connected to the sport. The moment I stepped out, I remained involved. I went and taught at a school that had a rowing program, and that was a fabulous place for me to learn about the other side of the sport, that is administering, coaching, educating, leading, all those sorts of things. And that was a wonderful grounding for me. But I always just felt this calling to always stay within the sport. And I just, again, by almost happenstance, circumstances, I kept getting drawn back in. Can you come and help us with this? Or would you mind coming along and doing this? And so whether it was doing some mentoring with underage teams pre the model we have now, or working in what was the sort of pathway program at that time, or being chair of the Athletes Commission, which is something that I just thoroughly enjoyed, and it was a great honour to do. So there's all these sort of little things along the way. And I think eventually, it might have been Boltz who said to me, he goes, you keep doing all this stuff for us, we might have to actually work out how to pay you for doing some of this stuff and employ you in the sport more broadly. I remember thinking, yeah, but I'm happy to keep doing what I do. So an opportunity was developed. I was able to sort of come in and work with Rowing Australia. As I said, a great privilege, and something that long may I be able to do for forever and a day, like some of the people that I've spoken about earlier in this chat. But the program changed. I guess one of the things we recognised was, how do you have a greater system impact on the sport? What we had been really successful at was probably operating in pods. And there was a bit of a term that we'd use, the great pods of the women's pair, with Tomo being supported through the AIS, or the awesome force of, Peter Anthony's and Stephen Hawkins with Tim McLaren. So they operated in these systems. And, we've had great fours out of UTS and great crews out of Sydney Uni or Melbourne Uni or the AOS or wherever it might be. But at times, it just seemed to lack a real system approach. And how do we get some of the knowledge and the information that I spoke to about that came from a person like Mike Mackay? How do we get that to filter down through a whole system? And how do we set up a structure that actually allows for more young men and women to have experiences like we've had and be afforded the opportunity, if worthy and if capable, to actually take that step and take the opportunity up and be successful long term? So, the campaign number one model came to life towards the end of the Rio cycle, and then got put in place, obviously, for the Tokyo cycle, where we went to the two national training centres, the women up in Penrith and the men in Canberra. And then below that, which I think is probably, all due respect to the two entities, which I think are just fabulous, the key thing was about, how do you set up a state-based pathway model to actually support that? And how do we set up a model that can identify those ones and twos, those really talented young men and women who ultimately find their way through by virtue of their grit, their capability, their capacity, their robustness, to actually put their hand up and say, I wouldn't mind having a go at that. I'm having a crack at walking into an Olympic stadium. And so keeping in mind that in the pathway, there's a number of sort of trigger points. So there's the junior team, the under-21 team, the under-23 team. Then they transition into the National Training Centre, which is, again, a transition point. The ultimate goal is going to the Games. And then beyond that is standing on the podium in the Games. So I see our role as very much about a long game. So whilst it's about finding talent, it's also about retaining talent in the system.
Yes.
And I think people like us, and I'm only a small part in that cog, people like you at Sydney Uni and many others around this network that I have the great good fortune to work with, it's about how do we support you and them to set up a model that is tailored to suit your local environment. Something that you guys know will work for your particular circumstances, that allows you to work with the young men and women in the sport to help them progress through it. And that, to me, is just such an invigorating space to be. But it is very much about a long-term vision. And one of the challenges that you can often have is that people sometimes think that talent development is linear. It's anything but that is the reality. It's not an escalator that you just jump on and go, zip, away you go. For some people it is. You think about the Kims and the Drews and people like that who potentially got on a shorter escalator and moved their way up, but clearly they had wonderful talent and skill and ability to do that. But for battlers like me, it was far from an escalator. It was more like snakes and ladders. And that is, depending on where I rolled that dice and what it landed on, I was either sliding down a snake 6 steps or I was hitting a ladder and going up 6 steps. And so that's what we've got to understand. It's not as simple as people might think. It's not as easy as just saying, Sarah Cook, You've got tall, long arms, you're not too bad in the cross country or whatever it might be. So you might have some aerobic capacity as well. You're a good person, so that's great. But you still got to then hop in a boat. You've got to have an ability to work with other people. You've got to be able to survive that. You've got to be able to train 10 to 14 times a week, year after year, and understand that your commitment to the sport is probably going to be something like 10 years or so to ultimately realise your ambition or dream. And that's for people like me, that was a reality. The battlers of the sport who just had to keep crawling inch by inch forward and hope at different times you picked up enough stuff along the way to actually make you take the next step. Whereas the Pathway program, I guess we're trying to build in some of that education. We're trying to have a more systematic approach. We're trying to work with the state body, with the National Institute Network, with the clubs, and with the framework that each state sets up to suit that local environment. And as I think about it a lot, it's obviously, I think my brain whirs at 1,000,000 miles an hour about this stuff. We want to be one of the best rowing nations in the world. We want to be one of the best Olympic sports in our country. We've got to be a bit careful sometimes that we think that we've also got to win everything below that as well. Yeah, it is nice. It's great if we can have success along the way. I think it's quite affirming for young people to have, like Rob Black's been on your show. His journey was a really interesting one. He's been through every step on the pathway. He's had ups and downs along the way too. But sometimes it's also about understanding that you've got to invest for the long term and to ensure that, I guess, those young athletes who we identify that, potentially have some of that talent, we know we've also got to invest in other aspects too. We've got to set them up for the long term. So if we want to be the best senior team, the best Olympic team, we've seen countries who do extremely well in the underage space, but it doesn't necessarily transfer. So we've got to be a little bit careful about the narrative or the story that we keep telling ourselves. Because keeping in mind every country has slightly different circumstances, be it geography or university timetable, summer holidays, or just how easy it is to get to and from training and those sorts of things, which all influences outcomes.
I think you've hit some really interesting points there, that one about not winning at every step, not having to be the best at every step along the way, but understanding what those data points for success might be at an Olympic gold level, and that we're on a trajectory towards that, although that trajectory might not be linear. And this has been a real key theme in all of my chats, is that there's been very few athletes, maybe on paper their trajectory looks linear, but actually, like a Rob Black, twice under 23 world champion, he's at the NTCs, but you talk to him and you understand it's anything but. It's about getting through those setbacks and those ups and downs. And I think of someone like David Crawshay, Olympic gold medalist. When he won his Olympic gold medal, he was, in his late 20s, and it was the first A final he'd made internationally, was the one that he won his Olympic gold medal in. So, it's about understanding, like I said, those data points for success, like you're doing with this systematic approach to development in the sport, and understanding where those triggers, are.
Yeah. And look, I think the other bit that's important too, Cookie, and, we've chatted about this in other spaces, it's understanding the life load. So it's a phrase that I've coined, and I talk a lot about that with our network partners, the leads in each state that I work closely with. So we know that a young person, it's a challenging, complex world for them now. Just the roads are busier. They've got these horrible things called mobile phones and social media platforms and things that I'm still trying to understand. But there's so many things pulling on their time and their energy, and at the same time, we want them to maintain a relationship with their mums and dads. We want them to experience having girlfriends and boyfriends. Most of them are going to have to work to make ends meet. They're studying, or they're doing a trade, or there's some other vocation or purpose in life that they have, which I think is so incredibly important. And at the same time, we want them to train and be really, really successful. So how, because balance is just this horrible word in elite sport, but there's not balance.
There is no balance.
It's far from balance. But what it is prioritising and periodising along the way. So what's important? So if we want to make sure that someone finds a Sarah Cook in the ACT, coming out of girls' grammar, and how do we progress her through a system? And we go, right, you've got to today turn up and start doing 14 to 16 sessions because we want to win a junior or under 23 medal. And you might go, great. But after a year or two, you go, what? How are we going to do that? You know, what comes next? You know, what else is in my life? And you go, no, what we need to understand is what's Sarah's ambitions from a life perspective, you know, rowing perspective, and how do we find a way to help navigate that part of her life with her at the same time as having this athletic dream and journey sort of running parallel. Because we want you to stay in the sport for a long time. On average, you spoke about Crouch. Me, I was 28. Lots of people are in their late 20s, have been to more than one Olympic Games. And that's what the statistics tell us. There are a small percentage of people who go to their first games and who are in our sport who are successful or on the podium. Most of us battlers go for more than one games, need to travel across more than one cycle, need to build a bank of maturity and experience that is somewhere in the 8 to 10 to 12 year range when we finally realise that ultimate dream of standing on a podium. So how do we invest in people? How do we retain them for the long period? And for me, in the network, in the pathway, it's investing in that lifeblood. It's understanding them. It's walking side by side with our young men and women to set them up for the future, to make sure they're robust and ready, make sure they're NTC ready. So when they move into that more elite professional phase, they're able to be retained. Because what I'd hate to see is that we have them for 1 to 4 years and then we don't see them again. They've invested so much. The states, their families, the sport of rowing have all invested so much into them getting to that point. How do we keep them in the sport? And then our pathway provides the pressure to keep them honest. You know?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think what you're doing is great work, and certainly the sport of rowing has come a long way in developing that system, and you've been a key driver to that. We're very lucky to have you and someone so passionate about this space and the sport, you know, driving this system approach to that development pathway for rowing. And I know that Lucy, who produces this segment for us, is going to kill me because we're probably the two worst people to have on this hammer, because I think we're intensely passionate about the same thing. And I think we might have broken the record for the longest interview so far. So let's go into the fast five, which is the 5 questions I ask all of my guests at the end of each interview. We're going to go straight into it. Your favourite course to row on in the world?
Lake Barrington.
That's been a popular choice, along with Lucerne.
Yes, well, I was going to say Lucerne would be my other.
Yep, very popular. Top track to erg to, or were you a no music erger?
Oh, geez, that's a good one. Look, I'm a massive country fan, so it'd have to be anything country.
Anything country. You're the first person who's offered up country as an option.
Get on board, people. Come on.
The best piece of advice that you've been given?
Wow, that's a good one. Yeah, look, I've probably had a lot of advice given to me, but look, there's no guarantee of a tomorrow, and I've learnt that personally. I've learnt that in other ways. So the biggest thing that I probably think is that there is no guarantee of tomorrow, but how do you make the most of today?
It's really great advice. Your career highlight to date?
Oh, Jesus. I don't know if it's a highlight. In 2000, I had a moment where we'd finished the games. It was about an hour afterwards. Everyone had basically vacated the premises at Cirque. I was standing there next to our boat. There was Reinhold, Peppy or Brett Hayman, Ziggy, Nick Porzik. There was the 4 of us. 4 guys had been on a 7-year journey together. We'd been through thick and thin. We'd had our ups and downs. But here we were, having just won an Olympic silver medal in our home country. But it was really poignant because here we were still doing the things that we'd always done together. And it was the 4 of us who had been together for that length of time, chatting, laughing, de-rigging the boat for the final time. And it dawned on me almost in a melancholy way that this is the last time I would be with these 3 gentlemen, 3 people I considered my family. And this was it. That was done.
Mm.
So that to me was probably a really significant moment.
Yeah, that's incredibly emotional hearing you talk about it like that, and it is like that, isn't it? You wake up the day after an Olympic Games or World Championships and you think, what now? But
I was back at work a week later, teaching kids. One Asa High on the south side of Canberra, having a ball. But you know what? That was life. So that moment to me, the more I've reflected on it over the decades, and it's been decades now, and I feel every one of those. That was a special moment because that's ultimately what the sport has been for me, the people.
I think that's an incredible highlight. And the final one, the hardest session you've ever done?
Probably wasn't on water. Ronnie was a tyrant. He used to make us run up and down Black Mountain every Tuesday afternoon. And we would start at the bottom and we'd go all the way around the top, and it was a 3K loop, and we'd do 3 laps. So we'd run 18 Ks every Tuesday afternoon up and down that hill with him and Peppy in the car, often with the aircon or the heater, depending on the season, sort of laughing at us as we went up and down this bloody hill.
Why wasn't Peppy running it?
He was slack. But I was 100+ kilo heavyweight.
Oh, man.
6'5", going up and down this hill. But they were tough sessions. But the toughest thing was going to the gym the next day trying to do deep squats.
Oh.
That's when you really felt it. But you know what? I think we could finish races pretty well as a result. So,
yep, that's true.
They were tough sessions, that's for sure.
Oh, I don't doubt it. Knowing Black Mountain very well, I completely empathise with that.
Yeah. But anyway, that was good.
Hamma, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time and for your passion, and it's been fantastic to hear about not only the work that you're doing, but your early career and how you found the sport. A really interesting journey. So thank you very much, and all the very best, I guess, in the lead up to the Tokyo Olympics, but more importantly for you and your role, the teams for the 24 and 28 Olympics.
Absolutely. Thanks, Cookie. Really love it and appreciate having had the opportunity.